Live from the heart of the downtown east side, it's Talk Recovery Radio with Giuseppe Ganci and Darren Gaylor on Vancouver's Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. From the streets to the studio, bringing you addiction recovery stories from real people with lived experience and real experts on today's issues. Powered by New West Recovery, Canada's largest addiction recovery community. Last Door and Westminster House. Tune in live every Thursday noon to 1. Real people, real issues, real life. Talk Recovery Radio.
And good afternoon. Good afternoon to all of our listeners and followers. Hello, Darren.
Woo! That made me happy.
That made you happy, really happy. For all of our listeners. A new intro was created there for you and us.
A big shout out, produced by Matt Morgan at Matt Morgan, M Morgan Productions, voiced by Michael Morgan at Michael Morgan Voices, and the sound engineer, music, and the post-production by Frank Ludwig at Quantum Sound. Big thank you to those guys for doing that. And we got a lot more of that for our show, just to boost it up a little bit. I miss having that intro song, and being in the studio and seeing those pictures just brought it back.
Yeah. Due to COVID, the studio's closed down right now, so we've had to improvise. But it's actually been good for us. We're now Facebook Living and then restreaming on the radio station. So if you're catching us on 100.5 FM, we're 1 week behind because it takes a little while to get there, I guess. But, this whole Facebook Live thing has really been rewarding, and, I'm trying to make way. And so these new sound bites are going to be coming through just to improvise because we can't play music anymore when we're on Facebook Live. We're also now on Spotify. So, we're restreaming on iTunes, Google Music, SoundCloud. You can replay all of our shows. TalkRecoveryRadio.com are there, and also on YouTube. So, replay the shows, 7 seasons, hundreds of guests, thousands of listeners. Really want to put a big shout out there. And
that just means that much information.
Yeah.
All along, like addiction, recovery, harm reduction, policies, spirituality, like so many therapeutic ideas, and like that's a lot of information. I'm so proud and happy to be a part of that. Mm-hmm. Content.
Yeah, well, you've got all these shows that either just talk about recovery in one sense of the, abstinence, and you got others that just talk about harm reduction. And, we try to talk about it all and let you, the viewers, decide. I mean, I'm personally in recovery. Darren, everyone knows his story and all that. If you listen to past shows, many pathways, there's lots of conversations. But one thing that we got to remember is that the recovery is possible, attainable, and sustainable. And that's one of the reasons why we do this show, because for some reason, there's a time that recovery's kind of been left out of the conversation, and we're doing our part to keep it in there. If you can see that picture behind me, I'm hoping we can do this again. We're already starting to plan Recovery Month in Canada. I'm one of the key people in that, and so is Darren, and hopefully we can have crowds out there again. So we're planning Recovery Day for September 4th, 2021, but we'll see what happens, obviously. So hot topics, we usually start the show off. We're going to get into our first guest pretty soon, but I just wanted to make an announcement. Alberta has launched a new way to monitor substance use in their province. This is a really big deal because what this is doing is called the Substance Use Surveillance Data System, and it's reporting on prescribing patterns, misuse, drug overdoses, and deaths, and kind of trying to get a picture of what the heck is going on. And it's really important because, a lot of provinces just kind of like flooded the market with medications to treat addiction, but nobody's really taking a look at what that's actually done to people who use substances. And from my own personal lived experience and lots of my friends with lived experience, that's caused a lot of harm in their life. So Alberta's taking a look at that. So, Google it, go online, substance use surveillance data. It's the first in Canada to really take a look at, what is happening to people who use substances rather than just looking at the acute, obviously overdoses and so forth, which needs to be looked at. But we can't just look at that. I mean, when you talk about COVID, we're not just looking at the deaths, we're looking at the recovery rates of COVID as well. I've never, up until this came out, really took a look at, well, what are the recovery rates for addiction in Canada? Like nobody knows, not even Health Canada. It's like one of the worst, crises we've had, and nobody can really say what the recovery rates are in Canada when it comes to addiction. So, hopefully, we, with our Recovery Month and Recovery Day, we can, get Health Canada to take a look at that and understand like there's a big flaw here.
Just really quickly, I mean, I assume that the rates we learn about are to help develop a treatment structure and moving forward, right?
Moving forward, yeah. So we'll bring somebody in from Alberta to talk about the substance use surveillance data. You're listening to Talk Recovery Radio. We're noon here live in Vancouver, but we've got somebody from that we call it the East Coast, even though it's not the East Coast, it's the middle of Canada, but it's a BC thing when we say Ontario. We are privileged to have and thankful to have Honourable Michael Tibollo. He is currently serving as the Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions in Ontario. He was elected to the Legislative Assembly in Ontario in 2018, and he represents the riding of Vaughan Woodbridge. Welcome to the show, Minister Tibollo.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you, gentlemen, today.
I'm an Ontario born, I was born there, Windsor, Ontario.
Okay.
My substance use got me to do the geographical change. I thought it was Ontario's fault that I was an addict. And so I moved to BC, but we all know how that went. And so thankfully I found recovery eventually, but welcome to the show.
Thank you. I spent 3 years, by the way, in Windsor. I went to law school there.
Oh, did you? Excellent. Yeah.
Quite familiar. And your last name is obviously Italian. So I'm quite familiar with the Italian community out there.
My family is a big part of that community. I definitely miss the Sunday cannolis. They just don't make cannolis like they do in Ontario here in BC. Or pizza. So I want to talk about what is going on in Canada. So let's talk about Ontario. I was in a stakeholder meeting once here in BC, and there was a bunch of people in government, and it was all kind of new, this whole overdose crisis and so forth. And somebody said to people at the table, trying to solve this is like being on a sailboat in the middle of a hurricane. You're just being torn everywhere and no solutions. Like, you got all this evidence saying this works and this doesn't work. And then you turn around and you say this evidence works and that doesn't work. And everyone's fighting and, all this, that's what it's like in BC. What's going on in Ontario? Or, is it smooth sailing for you? Or are you feeling like you're in that storm?
Yeah, I'm living the dream. I did a little bit of background about me. I was the chairman for Caritas, a residential therapeutic community that was started by a priest 45 years ago. I ran it for about 10 years as something that I was really passionate about and wanted to make some change. But I'm not sure about the BC story, but here the issue has always been that we've really not had a structure for mental health and addictions. Part of it, I think, has to do with the stigma associated with addictions and mental health. Being Italian, my God, you've got a son that's got a problem. What did you do wrong? Why weren't you paying attention? You're a bad parent. So, we don't talk about it. We bury it. And what's happened as a result of that is that a lot of grassroots organizations came into being. So there are about 600 organizations throughout the province of Ontario that don't really get funded from the government. They get their money from fundraisers, from pasta fagioli nights, from all these different, and the government, has been kind of like a hodgepodge. It's never had a strategy for mental health and addictions. And I lived it for 10 years running an organization because we were constantly hand in hand looking for money to help men with residential therapeutic communities that are long-term, 2 years plus. They're almost non-existent because how do you fund something like that? And, we know there's a lot of support that shows that people that have the social determinants of health as part of the makeup, the composition of how they ended up with an addiction, they're the ones that would benefit the most from them. But because they're not funded by government, at least in Ontario, they never get the benefit of a residential therapeutic community. And we
They
have
don't they don't even know about it. And it's one of
exactly,
those,
exactly.
I mean, when I was in Ontario, over a decade ago anyway, I had heard about this place called Brentwood in Windsor, but I didn't know, like nobody told me. I didn't my doctor, like nobody said, hey, like there was no conversation really. And I don't know, like when I think of Ontario, I think of addiction and I think of CAMH, right? But I don't think of, like when I think of recovery, I don't, like there's nothing to really think about. It's kind of like, where are we going? And so what are some of the what are some of the proposals you have, or
So, yeah.
some of the goals you have to kind of create a recovery oriented system of care in Ontario?
So Giuseppe, I came with a lot of baggage, right? I spent 10 years in the trenches trying to help people. And I came to politics not because I was looking for a new career. You can tell I'm not a young guy here. I came to it because I realized that someone who had been on the front line and in the trenches needed to take charge and bring to the table what needed to get done. So in 2010, in the province of Ontario, there was a standing committee report that was completed in the legislature that said, the problem with mental health and addictions in this province is lack of accessibility, a fragmented system, lack of connectivity and wraparound services to support the individual. So that was in 2010. Promises. Along came Doug Ford, $3.8 billion over 10 years. I said, you know what? I've got to take the plunge here. I got to get myself into the position. So thankfully, he listened. He gave me a ministry because it did not exist. I know you have a full minister in BC, and Alberta has an associate like me. And I took the job very seriously because I came with 10 years of frontline experience. I'm roughly a year away from completing my doctorate in clinical psychology with a focus on recidivism and utilizing long-term residential therapeutic communities. So I came with a lot of knowledge, a lot of interest, and very passionate because two of my friends had lost sons to fentanyl overdoses. So I came to the job, I got it, and I started by building a foundational document. And that's what we call here in Ontario the roadmap to wellness. We looked at it from a lifespan model because it doesn't matter where you are in the lifespan. If you're a kid, then we should be looking at protecting, educating, building resiliency. If you're, an adult, then we need to look at, issues that for adults. If you're a senior, you look at the seniors. Then we wanted to, because there's evidence that supports recovery is only going to take place and recidivism rates are only going to be reduced when the services are provided close to the individual. So I looked at the province of Ontario, which is, huge in terms of distances to travel, and how do you provide those services? So we came up with a strategy for that. We consulted with 600 organizations. And then from my standpoint, being Italian, I understand the shame, the hypocrisy sometimes in my community with respect to talking about it. So I realized that we've got to be culturally sensitive. So, if you're Black, you need to have supports and have the connection to build a therapeutic alliance with someone else from your culture that understands you. There's no point in me trying because I will bring my baggage to the table and never really appreciate or take a long time to appreciate. And that goes for the LGBTQ2 community. It goes for the Francophone community. It goes for first responders and their specific needs. So we looked at that. And with that, we composed and built this foundational document. And now what I'm doing is I'm taking the $3.8 billion we committed to the problem, and I'm focusing in on accessibility. I'm building a client-centered model with wraparound services that are specific and targeted to the different parts around the province of Ontario, and trying to build a system that's client-centered, that's focused on the individual and takes them through.
I'm going to bring Darren in here and after this question, but I'm glad that this is the approach you're looking at because, Darren as well worked in the system. I work in a treatment center, and even in the last decade, there's been a big change when it's like prescription drugs. Here you go. Like we're going to prescribe everybody methadone, Suboxone. Here's your drugs. Like, let's just get you on something else. And nothing against those drugs. The treatment center I work at, people use it for tapering and all that. But we've realized It's substance addiction, substance misuse, whatever you want to call it. The drugs are the smallest part, and there's all this other behavioral stuff that goes on, and you can't say that because it's a disease, it's not a choice. And I know, I've been through it all. I've been through it all. So my question is, we're pushing this thing called recovery capital, building recovery capital, where medication is one piece, culture is a piece, family, your behaviors when it comes to criminal activity, like measuring all of your resources, measuring your spirituality, and calling it recovery management. Canada hasn't taken this recovery management approach. They've taken this, okay, you got addiction, they're treating it like heart disease. You have a heart issue, okay, here's the doctor, there's one way to fix heart disease, whatever that is that you need, a heart surgery or whatever it is. Smoking, quit smoking. Nobody says smoke moderately. But when it comes to addiction, it's like, okay, you use heroin, let's just deal with your heroin use. Like, forget the fact that you haven't been a father for 10 years, you still sell drugs. And so the whole idea is like really getting involved in this. Because I remember when I used to use substances, it was like I was told just take medication and just deal with it. That's who you are. I remember this sense of like the healthcare system failed me. Like, that's all I am, somebody that uses drugs. And the idea of building on my strengths, never was given. I didn't know I had any strengths. Meanwhile, I did. Yeah. So in Ontario's approach, like in BC, and Darren, I swear you'll get a question after this. We are, at 5-6 overdoses a day still. Ontario's numbers are high as well. How can you build on strengths when you have so many people dying? Is there a conversation on taking a look at, who's not dying and how are they not dying, and how can we help the people that may still be using with their support? Like, how do we honor people with lived experience that have stopped using? Because a lot of provinces are just not even talking about it.
Yeah, I done wrap that. That's a lot what you've just said. Yeah. And but to start off, you're talking about the biomedical model, where, we basically look at it as simply a disease, but we know now, and we have to use more of the Engel model with respect to biopsychosocial spirituality issues, and look at all the different factors and how they impact on the individual. We need to understand what the attachment issues were as the individual was growing up. We have to do things that will assist the individual to understand and improve those situations. We have to look at the social determinants of health. Where's that person living? What are the conditions with respect to employment, education? We need to understand those. And if we're going to find a solution that's client-centered, it has to be needs-based, and there has to be a continuum that's going to help that individual on all those different aspects. And I think that's what you're driving at when you're talking about recovery capital, is looking at that and saying, well, what are your strengths? And I haven't met an individual who was addicted who didn't just had incredibly talents just under the surface of that addiction. And what we need to do if we're going to help people, you're talking about help and honoring the people that have gone through it. Like, to me, they're my heroes. We used to call them tips. Truly important people, not VIPs, tips. And the reason they were tips was because they were the individuals who held the key to showing that you can come out on the other side, right? They're the ones that lived it, that experienced it, and that can relate. And that the model that I used to use is the therapeutic model that was, the Synanon model before it got, turned into a cult. But that model and how it's been utilized in Europe and in France now in particular, where it's got a really strong use rate in terms of, a model for helping individuals, but it's utilizing that peer support. So when you have a model of 2 years, you got guys that have been there for 24 months who become the responsibles for the ones that are there 18, and the ones that are 18 are the ones that are responsible for the ones that are there for 12 months, and the 12 for the 6, and the 6 for the 3, and the 3 for the novices coming into the program. And every one of them can tell you, I know exactly how you feel, because when I was there 3 months ago. And so you put them into an environment where they start to build that family, those attachment issues that need to be canvassed and addressed. And then you start giving them the opportunity to start to unravel themselves and see where those strengths are. And then, of course, You've got the therapists that are working with the individuals, not necessarily the meds. We do use meds because obviously we have to manage withdrawal. We also have to deal sometimes with complications as a result of use of illicit substances. But more importantly, and this is the part that I have yet to meet someone who's gone through the process that didn't have some kind of an underlying mental health issue. I'm still convinced that if I can figure out what the mental health underlying issues were for the individuals before they started using substances, because in most cases they're being used for coping mechanisms, I can help that individual do away with substances when I can teach them behaviors, or I can teach them new ways of cognitive development so that they don't need to look for substances to help them cope in those difficult situations. And that's the beauty of therapy. And I, you know, what you're saying about, you know, therapy and not necessarily, you know, pumping people full of shit. Sorry, I'm not sure if I can say that. Anyways, pumping people full of stuff. You want to help them by teaching them the skills that maybe they missed out on, or, you know, just a, you know, situation that they were able to hide because of the shame they felt talking about it with their parents. So, you know, that's what recovery is all about. And I, you know, I heard one of your podcasts, and that's why I reached out, or I had my staff reach out to say, you know, you guys are doing great work there. You're hitting it on the money in terms of what you're talking about. And I said, you know what, I'd like to participate and give you encouragement to keep doing what you're doing.
That's fantastic. I mean, I think I speak for a lot of our viewership and myself for sure. It's just a breath of fresh air to hear such insight coming from, you know, yourself, Minister, in your position, because, you know, maybe I'm watching too much American television or Fox News. It just seems that so much of the politics is there's these just agendas, and there's no personal relatability. There doesn't seem to be passion behind it. And that's always been my concern with you know, individuals in politics. It's like, I want to know where they're coming from, what they've done in the past that's going to give them their own structure and passion in this position. So I really appreciate you sharing that information. It was one of my questions actually before the show. So I'm just wondering, because I think you hit it directly on the head, where, you know, very much, you know, these differences in communities require differences in treatment and resources and solutions. And at the same point, you know, once this solution, this facility has been established in a community, there's so much more after that primary treatment, you know, and you spoke on it a little bit. Is there going to be a tracking, like we talked about the tracking of overdoses, and can we do some tracking of people in recovery and what successes they're having, and, you know, how much further their education has gone, and their jobs, their careers, to help benefit the policies and the politics, you know, for our government, of how big a deal, like you're saying, the tips these people are to society, to not being a strain on the economy yet, but more so giving into it. I mean, can you speak on any ideas around that?
Yeah, I you know, I think maybe where you're moving is to try to, you're suggesting, should there be a national strategy for addictions and mental health? And I definitely believe there should be. Yeah, I'm going to use as an analogy something that I did in 2010. I came up with this idea that we've got to celebrate who we are. And, you know, again, I apologize, my Italian heritage, right? And I said, we got to do something to recognize it. So I came up with Italian Heritage Month in June of each year to be celebrated in the province of Ontario. And we did it in 2010, which was Canada's 150th birthday. It took me 7 years, but 7 years later, in 2017, we got it passed as a motion. And now Italian Heritage Month is celebrated across Canada. And the beauty of it is, and I've, you know, been out to BC and met with the Italian community out there in Alberta and across Canada, and we celebrate that month, but we have to start somewhere. And so in this case, we started, by the way, that was Italy's 150th anniversary. So it took 7 years, but both of them were proclaimed on two very important historic days or years in Canada. But I think the important thing is, like, I don't have all the answers, and I don't pretend to. Having spent 10 years and being around people that I respected a great deal, I learned a lot from the group sessions that I used to run when I was at Caritas. And I met people that were, but for the grace of God, I used to say to myself, even to my kids, we somehow managed to take a turn that didn't take us down a path that would have, created a very different world for us. And I thank God every day for that. And I think to myself, you know what, they just are missing that element. So I really believe that we have to look at it from a biopsychosocial manner. We need to understand what the needs of the individual are, and we need to build a connected system within the area where the individual lives. So a step care model. And we need to be culturally sensitive to what we're doing. So those are the fundamental pieces of it. I'm hoping that what we're doing in Ontario will be a role model for the federal government or other ministries of mental health and addiction in other provinces.
I wanted to share with you, Minister, on this topic. So we're also part of Recovery Month Canada, and we did Motion M40. It was brought to the House a few months ago, and the Conservatives voted yes to make September officially designated Recovery Month Canada. And the only party that actually said no was the Liberal Party. So you talk about Italian Heritage Month. So we did a campaign, a bunch of volunteers. We called every MP in the country, emailed every MP in the country. The vote was brought to the House in October of 2020, even with COVID happening. And yeah, Kevin Lammer was the MP that did the no vote to a unanimous vote. So it just shows where this country is right now when it comes federally, like who would say no to Recovery Month Canada?
100%.
So, the Italians got Italian Heritage Month. That's awesome. So we're just trying to, keep recovery in the conversation, and yeah, we need to do a full evaluation of somebody, not just, hey, how's the heroin detox going, and awareness to moms and dads. Like, moms and dads have no idea. They go to Google and whatever comes up on Google, whoever's got a good SEO on a website, and then they just their doctor, and that's it. There's no conversation. We get lots of people, where I work anyway, like, the doctor never told me that I could stop using. Like, they actually told me if I stop using, I'd die. And Canadians need to know that yeah, recovery is possible and so forth. So we've got a few minutes left. COVID-19. You're also the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions. So, what are some strategies in place right now with COVID and mental health? Obviously, you said it a little while ago. If we can fix and help people with their mental health, maybe that will reduce addiction in the province of Ontario. So, is that a conversation right now that's going on? Do you have any proposals in place? What can Ontarians do and access right now today? In lieu of COVID-19?
So this is very much a huge concern. When COVID-19 hit, we immediately formed a mental health command table to monitor through an organization called Connects Ontario what the statistics were showing us in real time in the province. So anxiety, depression, suicide, relapse. And we started looking at all the numbers and monitoring them. We brought all the organizations together, and we would basically create the supports necessary. Because again, in a COVID-19 situation with a lockdown, you don't have face-to-face services. So immediately we started with internet-based cognitive behavioral therapy, kids helpline. We have a program called Bounce Back. We have one for first responders. We invested a lot of money. I just announced the week before last, $147 million in additional supports focused on helping people during the coronavirus period. Over 40,000 people took up the offer for cognitive behavioral therapy supports, therapy online. We had, a 180% increase in the number of people using Kids Helpline. We've done and invested a ton of money and really accelerated the development of that framework of the foundation by investing huge amounts of money to help as many people as possible. The problem is that in a COVID-19 scenario with a limitation on face-to-face, and not everything is accessible. So our mobile intervention crisis teams, where police have nurse practitioners attending a home when there's a call that somehow dealing with a mental health issue, 70% of our calls to police officers have become those types of calls. So rather than sending police and trying to deal with complex mental health issues, we send nurse practitioners or master social workers that specialize in mental health, in the hope that we can de-escalate and reduce the amount of potential violence, but also to give people the right kind of help they need. So we've invested a lot of money in that. We're going to continue doing that. Many of our services are online now because it's the only way of delivering services. But we took it very seriously, and our government at this point has invested over $750 million in the 2 years we've been in government to really start building that foundation and to start building the connectedness so that we have those wraparound services. I mean, just in support of housing and in programs for individuals in our corrections facilities. I'm sure if you visited yours, you're going to come with the same conclusion. I was the minister, and I would come back to the office and say to my deputy minister, what exactly do we correct in corrections? Because, you go in there, all you do is come out a better criminal, unfortunately. But now we've made investments in cognitive behavioral therapy. When an individual comes out of one of our corrections facilities, he's got a safe place to go with a bed. If he has any kind of addiction issue, we get him the supports. So we have those supports so that the individual isn't going to repeat and end up in a correction facility again. But it takes
Same
years,
thing with
right?
addiction treatment. I mean, we're an addiction, like your recovery communities. Like we can talk about addiction every day with patients, and they're just going to come out a better patient. So we talk about recovery every day: breakfast, lunch, dinner, recovery. What can you do better today? Who can you have faith in that's going to help you today? And next thing you know, you've got somebody that's not a patient. They're like a person that's doing better and wanting to live and have hope. It's so easy to, but it's just so complicated to actually put in practice.
Yeah, Giuseppe, my analogy for what you're saying is it's like learning a language. You keep on one word, and you keep on fighting and another word and another word. Next thing you know, you're talking in the language of, when the hell did I learn to speak the language? That's what recovery is, right? Yeah. It's that little step, that little win that you get every day, to the point then that all of a sudden you turn around and go, wow, I'm a different man or woman than I was, right?
We're going to have to bring you back on the show. This is a full hour show. We're run out of time. We got to get to our break and our next guest. We've been talking to Mr. Tibollo from Ontario, the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, talking with us about how Ontario plans on overcoming its addiction crisis and using recovery-oriented systems of care, hopefully building recovery capital. Want to leave on one soundbite, one visual. This is Recovery Day. I'm the chair of Recovery Day BC. This was obviously 2019. We had to cancel 2020. We're hoping 2021 happens. I go to Ontario quite a bit. I really want to shut down Yonge Street. I really want to have a recovery day in Toronto. Toronto doesn't have a recovery day. So you know what? I'm gonna be hitting you up. I'm gonna be calling you, and I'll be like, hey, I know the right people in Toronto. Like, we got to do this. So let's have that conversation one day. I hope you enjoyed yourself.
That picture looks like when Italy won the World Cup on St. Clair. So what I'm going to suggest to you is try to time Recovery Day in Ontario for when Italy wins the World Cup in June.
Okay, all right,
get
perfect.
You that audience.
Just so you know, that took 10 years to get to that stage. The first one was, you can bowl in the middle of the street. So it took 10 years, but we'll communicate. Thank you for being on the show. We'll definitely be in touch more. Really appreciate it. And, best of luck to you. And let's get through COVID and let's get through this overdose crisis. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks, Giuseppe. Much appreciated. Stay safe.
Thank you very much. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
All right. We are on the Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. Thanks for tuning in. Right into our second guest. We just spoke about building facilities and centers and what good are these centers unless they're providing the type of, instructed, science behind the, addiction and new therapies. And nonetheless, it's something we're going to have to learn about and ask questions about. And who better than Dr. Carlton Erickson? You are the Director of Addiction Science Research and Education Center at the University of Texas, and also the author of Science of Addiction, From Neurobiology to Treatment. And very welcome to the show, sir.
Good afternoon, Jordan.
This is such a huge conversation, such a huge topic. I think the centers and the psychologies and the doctors are still very much following the original paradigm in the DSM-3 when it first tried to explain addiction of some form. And there's little elements that are changing. Hopefully now we can prove the science, the genetics, and so much more information to further treat the disease of addiction. Are we getting there?
We're getting there, but I don't think we've proven an awful lot right now. Unfortunately for your audience, they're going to want a lot of yes/no answers, and scientists often don't have those. And so I'm here to help them understand however you want me to talk about a lot of different topics. There's a lot of different topics I have in my book. And also, you just talked about facilities. I don't even have that in my book, and I don't know much about the treatment facilities, although I have been in them.
Right. I mean, that's just it. The facilities are only as good as the best forms of treatment, I personally believe. And I think our listeners, our viewership, they desire information, understanding, and explanation of such a complex disease. I remember hearing, when I was first, introduced to treatment of this genetic, predisposition, and I saw people, making the excuse, it's not their fault anymore, what they're doing. I wondered why, I suffered an addiction. My brother didn't, if it's a genetic thing. I just couldn't believe in it. I couldn't wrap my head around it. But it's more than just a gene, say an alcoholic, sends to his son who becomes then an alcoholic, isn't it? Can you explain a little bit of the genetic explanation, if you will?
Sure. There are 1,000 places to start here, but I think just for your audience who probably doesn't know me, let me just give them a little bit of my background so you know where I'm coming from. I was trained as in a college of pharmacy, and I did have a pharmacy degree at one time. My wife is a retired pharmacist. I found out that pharmacy wasn't for me, but one of the subdisciplines of pharmacy called pharmacology is something that I was really excited about. So I have a PhD in pharmacology from Purdue University. And then I started to focus on what's called neuropharmacology, which is how drugs work in the brain. And so that's what pharmacologists do, is they try to understand how drugs work in the brain. And I want to let my audience, your audience know that I'm not a recovering addict. I'm not a recovering alcoholic. But the first grant I got funded from the National Institutes of Health happened to be on alcohol. And so I was studying alcohol in rats and mice back in the 1960s, when we didn't know what alcohol did very much. I was just trying to find out how alcohol caused intoxication in those animals. And to show you what a good job I did, we still don't understand how alcohol works in the brain to cause intoxication. And so it's a very complex molecule, very complex drug. But I got interested in the disease of alcoholism because of a natural extension of how does alcohol work in the brain. And so I started to attend 12-step meetings. That's the only way I knew to find out about the disease in the 1960s, because there wasn't much scientific literature on it. And I hung around recovering people. I got to know 12 steps quite well. I still highly respect the 12 steps, although I know they don't work for everyone. And so there are many exciting things that have occurred since then, part of which has to do with the genetics that you mentioned.
Yeah. It's so interesting to me now, you know, in 14 years of abstinent-based recovery, you know, where you think I'm beyond the problem, I'm beyond alcoholism, addiction, but I'm learning from the moods and the behaviors, you know, and especially now in isolation, like this is definitely you know, a brain-oriented sort of dysfunction, if you will, and I'm really looking in. I was on the website. I don't know if it's your website. You're on it there quite a bit. Addictioneducationsociety.org, and there was, you know, some write-ups on the you know, the what's the word, the mice and their genes, and showing that the alcohol is different. It was really interesting going through there, like to really understand that, yeah, I wasn't given an alcohol gene, but maybe I was given another gene that, you know, affected the substances when, you know, upon ingestion. Is there proof of genes that say, you know, make someone susceptible to anxiety, depression, and if so, could addiction be under the umbrella of mental health or a mental disorder?
Yeah, it currently isn't, because it's more of a political issue right now as to why it's not. For example, we have the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, which funds about 95% of all the research on alcohol in the United States. And then we have a separate institute called the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And people might say, well, why do we have two different institutes for this?
Right.
It's because the liquor manufacturers don't want alcohol to be thought of as a drug, but it certainly is a drug. And there's also an Institute of Mental Health, and alcohol is not in that either, even though that's where I happened to get my first grant from for alcohol research, is because they didn't have an Institute for Alcohol Abuse or drug abuse in the late 1960s. They only had a National Institute of Mental Health. But the reason is that we don't think about it as a mental health problem. We think about it as a drug problem. I personally think it is a subset of a mental illness. And so, you know, you talked about the DSM-3A, or the first one. Now there's a DSM-5. And one of the things that's critical for your audience to understand is that everyone who drinks alcohol too much too often is not an alcoholic. So we now have a diagnosis for what we call alcoholism, and we call alcoholism that word loosely because that's how people identify themselves in the AA rooms. But alcoholism really is not a scientific term any more than addiction is a scientific term.
Right.
And so in order to be classified these days as having an alcoholic problem, you have to go to the diagnostic criteria for the DSM-5, and there they're talking about, and you'll probably already know this, substance use disorders. One of the substances they have listed there is alcohol. Another one is cocaine. Another one is heroin. Another one is marijuana or cannabis. So they really then subset it by saying cannabis use disorder, alcohol use disorder, and so forth. Within each one of those disorders, there are 12 criteria that a person can satisfy to determine how severe their disorder to that drug is. And so if you look at 12 of those, actually there's 11, I'm sorry. If you have 2 or 3 of those, and this is determined by discussion with a qualified assessment counselor who knows something about how to diagnose, you have 2 or 3 of those, it said you have a mild, let's say, alcohol use disorder. If you qualify for 4 to 5 of those, you have a moderate use disorder, and 6 or more is a severe use disorder. And now the scientific literature and the clinicians are saying anyone who has 6 or more of those 11 diagnostic criteria has a severe alcohol use disorder, and that's closest to what we call alcohol addiction or alcoholism. However, no one stands at the door of a 12-step meeting and says, excuse me, are you a mild, are you a moderate, are you a severe alcohol use disordered individual? If you're mild, we don't want you in here. Actually, 12 steps tends to work better for people with mild to moderate alcohol use disorders rather than severe. Severe generally require heavy duty outpatient or inpatient treatment over a long period of time.
Right. And, dealing or diagnosing someone's substance use disorder, essentially you're asking them, quantities of use and so on. Can you diagnose addiction before substance use via the brain chemistry?
Not at this time, no. And so, so almost all of the research that's been going on over the last 30 to 40 years is in the, to find causes of this problem are in the neurobiological and genetic area. And so most of the research that's been done has been done with people who are labeled as alcoholics or now more lately diagnosed as severe alcohol disordered individuals. And this is where you get the brain scan data. This is where you get the genetic data and so forth. And so you really have to, it's like cancer. There are various severities of different types of cancer. It's like Parkinsonism. There's mild Parkinsonism, moderate Parkinsonism, severe Parkinsonism, and so forth. And so, they find out the most about the disease by looking at the severe forms, because that's where you start to see the brain chemistry changes that are involved with the inability to stop using alcohol, which characterizes severe alcohol use disorders. And by the way, you said you can diagnose by the frequency and quantity. Those are not any of the 11 criteria that they use for diagnosis. There's a lot of people who drink an awful lot, but they don't. One of my recovering friends says that his wife, he and his wife used to drink just the same amounts. They used to go to happy hours. They were on an Air Force base. They went to the happy hours, which are about 6 hours long, as I understand it, in military bases. And she used to drink just like he did. Pretty soon she came up to him and she said, I can't drink like you. Is it okay if I just have my 2 glasses of wine at night? And he said, sure, yeah, I understand. And then I was talking to him and he said, you know what, Carl? She didn't have what it took to be an alcoholic. And I really like that sentence, because some people don't have what it takes to develop severe alcohol dependence.
Well, it's even the stories. Some people show up to rehab and they smoke weed, and some people think, oh, you're not a real addict or an alcoholic. And it's like, I do heroin in the alleys. And it's when there's also the piece of, when you want to stop digging a hole in the ground, it's up to you. So, the medicalization of addiction recovery and the non-medical 12 steps and all that, there's a gray area, definitely. But I wanted to talk to you about your book, The Science of Addiction. You get this on just search it on Google, and you'll be able to find it everywhere to purchase it and so forth. What's the goal of the book?
This is the new edition, by the way. You have the first edition.
Oh, geez. I didn't know that. I'm sorry about that. Okay. I can see it. Let me stop sharing this one. And if you want to just put it in front of your shirt so it doesn't get caught up There you go. One more time. There you go. Because it was getting lost in the virtual screen.
Right.
So what's the goal? It's same title? I'm sorry, I can't see the title.
It's the same title. It's 10 years newer.
There you go. Oh,
2018.
okay. So the same title, Google that. We'll put an update on our Facebook page and so forth. So I pick up the book. Who's it intended for? Is it intended for moms, people who use, everybody, clinicians?
Yeah, it's intended for primarily counselors is where I
Okay.
started writing it for. And then lo and behold, I found out that the general public liked it. And now they're even using it in medical schools. I'm told that UCLA's Department of Psychology uses it as a textbook. I'm told that Menninger's Treatment Center in Houston uses it as a textbook. So it's turned out to be a textbook for health professional students as well as counselors, and then the general public can read it too. The second edition is just a little bit more technical than the first edition. They may get lost in the genetics chapter, but I've tried to make it as user-friendly as I can. And the main thing is, though, it's scientifically accurate. I had several of my scientific colleagues read over the chapters where I'm not an expert, and they said it was just great. And they also gave me extra references to put in there, and they told me how to explain it. So it's a very broad book. Some people say, excuse me, I have a cough. Some people say that it's real easy to read. Other people say, no, it's not so easy. You have to have a little bit of background or at least interest. So for those people who find a couple of the chapters, like how nerve cells talk to one another and the genetics, if they find those a little bit difficult, I say primarily start out reading the first 3 chapters, which are in layman's terms, and then maybe go to one of the last chapters, or pick out a chapter that you like. There's about 12 chapters, and that's the best way to read it. It can be used either from reading from front to back, which I would not recommend. They'll probably put you to sleep, or you can pick and choose the chapters that you want.
Well, and I think even for myself, this type of information gives me a sense of relief. I think I've matured enough to not, see it as an excuse to my previous behavior. But I get so many phone calls from, moms or brothers that they want the answer to the solution to fix the problem of their loved one. But for the most part, they're looking for a sense of relief in an understanding of something they just, cannot understand. And, it's one thing to say, well, they have a disease. It's a disease of the brain. And it's sort of that conversation usually ends there. But to really understand that, what I was born with was, fewer dopamine receptors than normal, and I have an extra protein that influences the amount of alcohol I consume. Like, just for example, now that can give a sense of relief and understanding, but what does it do for us in the sense of treatment? Like, do we have medication that can go directly to those situations, or is it more so to test and try to get ahead of the potential risk and vulnerability of that individual? What's the use of this information that's going to be best suited to deal with addiction?
Complex question. We started the show by you're saying we have the treatments from long ago, and it started out with 12 steps, and it's a lot of people who are down in 12 steps. I happen to be one of those people that really appreciates 12 steps because I have a lot of friends who are found recovery in 12-step programs. Yeah. And so I think it's great, but as I said, it doesn't seem to work for everyone. So scientists are busily trying to find the exact causes of, first of all, where alcohol and other drugs work in the brain to cause addiction. And secondly, how do you best make use of that information to overcome the problem? So it's pretty difficult to cure a disease or to overcome the symptoms of a disease by not knowing where it is. This is where some of the older scientific literature on alcohol, where I was actually around scientists who used to think that alcoholism began in the stomach. And then we went through a period where alcoholism was part of a liver problem. And now it's very clearly, based upon the really, really good neuroscience and genetics that have been coming out, it's clear that it's in the brain. So it starts in the brain. And what I learned a lot about the disease from a close friend of mine who recently died just last year after being sober for 45 years himself. I learned a lot about the disease, and he used to say that he never took a normal drink. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, all I knew is that as soon as I started drinking, something came over me and I just couldn't stop. Now he was never diagnosed, but he sounds to me, and I know a lot about his drinking behavior without even sitting down and putting a pencil, check, 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 check to these criteria, these diagnostic criteria that I mentioned earlier. He was probably a severe alcohol disordered individual. And so how he got better was abject, as he says, abject giving up. He was in a situation with his family, his friends. He was in Spain. He didn't have a lot of money, and finally he just laid down on the ground and he said, I give up. God help me. And he had a revelation. He had never took a drink again after that. But he had gone through many, many treatment centers, many, many 12-step programs, and nothing seemed to help. And so the lesson I learned from that is this is a long-term disease. You don't get it overnight, and you don't get rid of it overnight. And some people have to go to treatment 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 times. And I'm talking about heavy-duty inpatient 90-day treatment before they actually get better. So something has to change in the brain. And what he told me is that he was a master interventionist. He always intervened on people who came up to he and his wife and said, his wife was a counselor too, I just can't stop. Mm-hmm. And so what he learned from me as a scientist, we became friends because he wanted to know what was going on in his brain, why he couldn't stop drinking. And I wanted to know what it was like to have the disease. So he and I became close friends. And so he learned through the science that we now know in the brain that there's a particular part of the brain called the brain's reward pathway. Scientists call it the Mesolimbic dopamine system. And what he told me is, he said, what he found really works in intervening people who are denying that they have a problem is he'll say, stop. I don't want to hear any more of your stories. Just go like this. Put 2 fingers in the front of your head and put another one along the side of your right or left ear, and imagine where those lines cross in the middle of your brain. And that's where your problem is. And he says to those people, you got something wrong with your brain that nobody else who has this problem has. And so that's where it's occurring. And it's about time you admitted that it's not your problem. It's not your fault. You're not a bad person. You just happen to have a disease up here. And guess what? That's where it occurs. And we know how to fix it. How do we fix it? Well, so some people, it's very, very difficult. They have to really, really work hard at it. They have to first learn the first step. They have to go to meetings. They have to go to individual counseling sessions. And so I happen to be an informal counselor. I'm sorry, not a counselor, but a advisor for Hazelden Betty Ford, which is the largest treatment center in the nation right now. And they're very evidence-based, which is the only reason I work with them. They do use treatment principles that have been shown to work through scientific research. And what they do is they give you a 2-day assessment. They find everything about you, financial, spiritual, emotional, what all your problems are, family background, and so forth. Do a 2-day assessment, and they personalize the treatment for those individuals, and they try to take care of them holistically. And so holistic treatment to them looks like going to meetings, having structure to the day, having an excellent diet, learning how to relax, calling for help anytime you need it, and so forth. And the longer you stay in there and are off the drugs, they'll take care of your physical problems, your mental problems, get you off of medications that you don't need. And the longer you stay in there, the better it is. So the old standard is
taking care of the whole person is the approach we need to do. And I'm really good friends with lots of people at the Hazelton Betty Ford treatment center, and it's one of those things that I wish we could, all people, not just people with private insurance and with money, can go to. Like, all people have access to that type of treatment. And sadly, a lot of people are just going to outpatient clinics, getting their prescription and going home, and just the resources aren't there. We are running out of time. Today's been a full packed show. Definitely really appreciate you coming on to the show and talking about your book and the science and behind it, the science of addiction. So really appreciate you being on the show. We'll post the new book cover on our Facebook page and get people to learn about it. And, I had a doctor tell me once, I'll leave it on this, addiction is so complicated. We're years away because it's one of the only diseases known to man that you can actually be not cured from, but recover from without any medical intervention. And then some people need medical intervention. So how do you figure that conundrum out? And I'd like to talk to you about that next time if we have more time, because that's an interesting comment that I remember listening to. Appreciate you being on the show. Thank you very much, but we've definitely run out of time. Darren, it was great to see you. Hopefully one day we'll be back in the studio. You're listening to Talk Recovery Radio, powered by New West Recovery. And we are now on Spotify too. So replay the show, Spotify, iTunes, Google Music, YouTube, everywhere. Just go to talkrecoveryradio.com for all of our past shows. Thanks for listening, everybody. Thank you for being on our show, Dr. Erickson. Thank you. Okay, everyone, take care. See you next Thursday. Bye, all. Thank you.